Welcome to Contact. I'm Craig Delahunt, and on today's show we'll be talking with biologist John Werring, former investigator for the Forest Practices Board and now with the Sierra Legal Defense Fund. Thank you very much for joining us, John.
Hey, Craig.
John, for those who don't know, what is the Sierra Legal Defense Fund?
The Sierra Legal Defense Fund is a non-profit environmental law firm that provides free legal services to environmental groups and the public at large. If a citizen or a group has an issue that involves legal matters or an environmental situation that requires some kind of legal restitution, be it a lawsuit or the possibility of delaying of charges or themselves being sued by a large corporation for taking action against the corporation in some way in a boycott manner, then the Sierra Legal Defense Fund will provide free legal services on a case-by-case basis.
Is it related in any way to the Sierra Club?
No, we're not associated with the Sierra Club. It's just a coincidence that our names are the same. There is a group called the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund in the United States, and the founder of the Sierra Legal Defense Fund in the United States was a former employee of that organization, and for want of a better name, he just chose Sierra and dropped the club. It causes some confusion, but we're not associated.
Let's talk about the Forest Practices Code. Why did this seem like such a great step forward in regards to responsible forestry in BC?
Well, the Forest Practices Code, in fact, it was a great step forward because in this province we had virtually no legislation that governed forestry as an industry. We had other pieces of legislation that could be applied to forestry operations, such as the Waste Management Act, if there was a spill of oil or gas, or if excessive litter in the forest, and the Fisheries Act in a situation where streams may have been damaged by logging. The problem is there was never anybody in the field to enforce them, and the government came up with this new initiative of environmental enforcement, supposedly, or environmental legislation that covers the forest industry in particular, and now actually applies specific penalties for forestry-related activities, and we've never had that before. So the code itself is wanting in several respects, but the fact that we have one is a benefit.
Has it cost industry a lot of money? There have been claims that it has.
Well, currently the industry is lobbying government to reduce the initiatives in the code to make it less stringent, to streamline the application process for the permitting process for logging, which I don't think anybody would really have a problem with. Anybody in an industry of any sort or any kind of business doesn't want to be smothered in red tape. And unfortunately, the way the code is written, it's very paper-driven, it's very process-oriented, and there are a lot of really arduous tasks that interconnecting approval processes that need to be done. For example, if a logging company wants to log a cut block, they have to, or an area, they have to prepare a 5-year development plan. And then for individual cut blocks that are identified in that 5-year plan over a period of 5 years, they have to prepare a silviculture prescription. That silviculture prescription must be in compliance with the logging, the development plan. Then just before they log, they have to prepare a logging plan. The silviculture prescription identifies the area to be cut, the kind of trees that are there, the method in which those trees will be removed, and what trees will be replanted and what will be done to restore the area. The logging plan is prepared just before they're logging, and that defines the type of equipment, how many people are going to be on site, where the equipment is going to be positioned throughout the cut block. Are they going to be high lead yarding, or are they going to be skidding logs? And that sort of situation. The problem is right now is that...
Well, are they justified in saying that their costs have gone up and because of the code?
Well, no, not necessarily, because these processes have been an integral part of the forestry over the last 50 years anyway. In their forest licenses, before the code ever came into effect, they were still required to prepare forest development plans, silviculture prescriptions, and logging plans. And road building permits. They had to do the engineering for roads. So all the code simply did was it captured all of these various components of the forest planning process and put them under one piece of legislation.
Well, why did the Forest Alliance and most of the forest industry put up so much resistance to the code's implementation and to its enforcement?
Well, the resistance to the implementation, again, is the process problem that I was talking about. For example, if a company has prepared all the appropriate documentation and they're out on a cut block and they're logging, and they come across what is an unidentified feature or previously unidentified feature. This could be a mineral lick for animals, or it could be a hide-a-war canoe sitting in the middle of the bush, or a stream that they had not properly or had previously identified. They have to stop logging and then go away and modify their logging plan. And because they modified their logging plan, they have to modify their silviculture prescription, because both have to be in compliance with each other. And because they've modified their silviculture prescription, they have to modify their forest development plan. And if it's a major modification to the plan, then they have to put that modification out for public review for a period of 30 to 60 days. And essentially what they have to do is shut their operation down for a couple of months until it goes through this process, and then the new plans are reapproved. And that is a very arduous process. Now, the government's attempting to streamline that.
Oh, isn't this the reason that M&B has said they'd shut down the logging operations in Clayoquot Sound for a year?
No, actually, the Clayoquot Sound operations were governed by a completely different, well, the Forest Practices Code applied there, but at the same time, they had more rigorous tests that they had to apply to their logging operations as dictated by the scientific panel for Clayoquot Sound. So it was, relative to normal forestry operations around the province, it was even more arduous or more difficult to get plans approved there. There were more bodies that were involved in the review of the plans and determinations on where logging should take place, and the Nachalnut Tribal Council, or the First Nations, being one of those bodies. The closing down of operations in Clayoquot Sound, you know, can be viewed to be as a result of high costs, but it may also be, and some people do believe, that it may be a political ploy at this point in time.
Now, in an article in the Vancouver Sun, you emphatically stated that you would like to see the Forest Practices Code kept in its entirety. Could you tell us why?
The code, as it sits right now, is the only thing that we have that is directly applicable to logging, and to change it and to modify it to make it less rigorous than it is. From a planning perspective, as I described, and the interconnectivity of the plans and the arduous nature of putting together the planning process and changing things, that I think any reasonable person, any business person would understand, well, that's a lot of red tape, and it's really it should be changed. And I think for the most part, many of us agree that changing that is not going to affect anything on the ground, although it may speed up some plan approvals. But the government is also considering changing specific sections of the code, like the forest road regulations that govern road building on steep slopes. Roads are notorious for creating or being the main reason why landslides occur in areas of timber harvest. And the companies want less restrictions on road building than the code applies for now. And we say, no, absolutely not. In fact, if anything, they should be made somewhat tougher. Some of the changes the companies want are, currently they're required under the code to, if they're going to build a road in an area that has a moderate hazard of landslide, moderate likelihood of the landslide, they have to do a terrain stability assessment. Well, the company wants that dropped. They don't want to have to do it, they only want to have to do terrain stability assessments where there's a high likelihood of landslide. Well, we've seen what's happened in the past. Thousands of landslides caused by roads built on moderate slopes. And we maintain that those terrain stability assessments should continue in those situations. The problem is the government is considering these changes. The other thing the companies want are things like terrain stability assessments under the Forest Practices Code as of July 15th of 1997 must be conducted by a professional geoscientist. The companies want that pushed back another 5 years into the years 2000, because they argue that, well, there aren't enough geoscientists around to do the terrain stability assessments. I tend to disagree with them. I think there are enough qualified people. It's a cost thing. You know, instead of paying a professional, they would rather have their bulldozer operator who's pushing the road through determine whether he's going through unstable terrain. I think that's wrong. I think, you know, you should identify these areas before you go in there and build them, and do the appropriate engineering before you build the road, not as you build the road.
What's the Forest Practices Board, and what was your position with them?
The Forest Practices Board is a body that was formed under the Forest Practices Code as a legislated body to provide what was determined to be an independent watchdog group of investigators and legal counsel that would monitor the application of the Forest Practices Code across the board for industry as well as government. They would receive complaints from the public and deal with those complaints in a manner that once the complaint was received, you respond to the complaint and then determine whether it meets the board's criteria for investigation, and if it does, then it must be investigated. It's similar to the ombudsman. In fact, the whole process for complaint investigation is set up in a manner similar to the ombudsman's office.
Well, as an ex-investigator, what are some of your impressions regarding enforcement of the code in BC?
Well,
and were you actually muzzled while you were an investigator?
While I was an investigator, I had some problems. I left the board specifically because and I don't believe it was a perception, I think it was fact. In fact, I talked to some of the people that I worked with that seemed to confirm some of the situations I found myself in. Complaints were coming in from parts of the province, for example, and one of the processes that we all agreed to as the investigative team to sit down was to disclose whether we had any involvement in those areas or involvement with any people in those areas, and if so, would our involvement in a complaint about an activity in that area, be it forestry or Ministry of Forests or forest company, would our involvement have any possible perceived conflict of interest, or is there any way that that any of the people or parties to the complaint could benefit either in a positive or negative manner as a result of our involvement? Well, the board decided that we would apply this test. So a complaint came in from a jurisdiction in the province that I've worked in, and there are very few jurisdictions in the province I haven't worked in at this point in time. And when we sat down to discuss should we be involved in this complaint or whatever, I disclosed that at one time I had worked in that area, and I had, because we're a nonprofit organization, we try to, at CR Legal Defense Fund, we try to minimize our expenses, and a person volunteered their cabin on a lake for me to stay in one night because it was a convenient location, and I stayed there one night. I'd never met the person. I simply stayed at the cabin, and as it turned out, 6 months later they were a party to one of the complaints sent to the board. The board decided that because I stayed at that cabin I should not be involved in any complaints coming from that jurisdiction because there was a perceived conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. Now let's flip that over to the other side. There were two other investigators that worked with me, and a complaint came in from another jurisdiction. One of those investigators said, "Oh, well, I really want to go and work there because one of my friends works for the forest company, and it was a forest company that by coincidence the board would be investigating, and I want to go and visit him and fish with him and stay with him and have dinner with him, and it would be really good to see this person again. I haven't seen him in several years." The other investigator disclosed that he was close personal friends with the shareholders of another forest company that would be under investigation. I disclosed that my previous employer, Sierra Legal Defense Fund, was involved in preparing the complaint on behalf of the people making the complaint. Well, I was excluded from that investigation, but these other two people that had very clear biases and very clear situations where one party could benefit or another because of a decision, or the investigator's mind could sway to one side or the other because of a relationship with a person in that organization. Both of those investigators were assigned to that complaint. I was not, and I was told that basically I would be under that kind of a constraint for a year until any perception of conflict of interest or bias disappeared. Now, I came into the board believing I'm going to be a very independent and very objective person. I mean, that's the way I've always been. These other people, these other two investigators, were government employees. One was with the Ministry of Forests, and one had come from the BC Assessment Authority. So I saw an imbalance there that just wasn't justified in any way, and I felt that I was being restricted from conducting activities in a fair and reasonable manner.
Do you think the government is actually in conflict of interest, actually being involved with the Forest Practices Board?
Well,
it seems like again, it's the fox. I mean, they've got a vested interest, and I mean, they're getting stumpage.
Well, let's put it this way: the board was set up as an independent investigative body to act on behalf of the people of the province, to monitor the Ministry of Forests and to monitor the industry in the application and enforcement of the code. The way the board was made up is that there were 6 board members, and all of them had some kind of tie to forestry, either as a consultant or as a One of them was a union representative for the IAWA. One of them was an chief executive officer for some of the forest companies. One of them was a forestry professor at UBC. One of them was a range, the range person. Their partner was involved directly with the forestry, and they were, a close relationship with a lot of the district managers in the Ministry of Forests. The director of the executive director for the board, underneath the board itself, came from the Ministry of Forests. The director of communications came from the Ministry of Forests. The director of audits came from the Ministry of Forests. The investigator seconded to the board came from the Ministry of Forests, and the Ministry of Forests controlled the payroll. I did not see that to be independent in any way, shape, or form. That is a very strict and very direct control on the board. In fact, at times, the minister himself was directing the board on where they should apply an investigation, and there's no independence in that. I felt I had no role where there was no independent body. I came in there with my eyes open, thinking this was going to be a wonderful opportunity for independent investigations aside from government and industry to really see what was happening in the forests.
Now, you've just gotten back from an expedition up the Klanawa River. Can you tell us what's going on out there and all across BC right now?
Well, currently, the Sierra Legal Defense Fund is looking at various applications of the Forest Practices Code, because when the code was brought into effect, the government held this up as a model to the world, saying we have the best forestry practices in the world. We have very stringent legislation. We have million-dollar fines. We have tough enforcement. And we are going to change the way forestry is done in the province of British Columbia. Well, since the code has come into effect, we've decided to go out and say, is this really true? One of the promises that the government made, and this is documented through several media releases, comments made to the newspaper, comments made on television, was that one of the quotes made was that clear cuts the size of football fields would no longer be tolerated. Well, a football field is only 1 hectare, or less than a hectare, sorry, about 0.1 of a hectare. We're seeing plans that are being submitted by licensees to the government and plans that are being approved by the government where cut blocks are 500, 1,000, 1,100, 2,500 hectares, where the code says that in any jurisdiction in the province, the largest clear cut under the code can be 60 hectares, which is still 600 football fields. The government is basically lying to the people of the province and to the world that we're no longer clear cutting on a grand scale. In fact, I just recently reviewed a forest development plan that is up for approval. It's out for public review. There's a 2,500 hectare clear cut on it. And it flies completely in the face of the whole intent of the code. The other thing the government was saying is that they were going to protect wildlife. That they would not be harvesting timber in areas where wildlife are important, or where wildlife where an old growth dependent species like the marbled murrelet requires certain habitats. The grizzly bear requires certain habitats. The problem is that the way the code is written is that a licensee or the government are only required to protect identified wildlife. Identified wildlife are wildlife species that have been agreed to by the Minister of Environment and by the Chief Forester that these wildlife species should specifically be protected. Well, they've never designated any wildlife. Therefore, all of the wildlife protection provisions in the code don't apply. We have provisions in the code to protect biodiversity over the landscape, to allow for interconnectivity of forests, to provide corridors for wildlife to move through, to provide wildlife tree patches and wildlife diversity on cut blocks. The problem is that the biodiversity requirements of the Forest Practices Code are driven by a process called landscape units. Landscape units are, you break the landscape down into individual little watersheds, and you maintain a level of biodiversity within those watersheds. And the whole biodiversity provisions of the code are driven by landscape units. But the landscape units must be designated by the Chief Forester, and there have been no landscape units designated, and currently the government's position is they don't plan to designate any landscape units for the next 5 years. The other thing is stream protection. The government mandates that we will no longer log streams, that we will protect streams for fish, for water quality, for stream temperature. We will provide riparian or streamside protection by leaving trees adjacent to streams, and that there will no longer be clear cutting streams. Well, we currently are in the process of preparing a report which we release this coming Thursday that clearly identifies that well over 90% of all of the riparian management areas or streamside protection zones that are specified in the code are they don't exist. They're being clear cut in the field. The timber is still being felled across streams and yarded and dragged through streams the way it has in the past. Nothing has changed. It's a complete perception. The government is holding this model up and saying, we've got all this, we've got this wonderful code, but it's not being applied.
Well, using the Klanawa as an example, can you show how what's happening out in the bush right now is basically one of the major causes of the devastation of our salmon runs?
And using the Klanawa River?
Well, the Klanawa as an example, or many of the hundreds of other little rivers.
There are lots of rivers in the province, but let's look at the Klanawa, for example. You can drive down the Klanawa over its entire length and look at it, and in places you find that the river itself, especially during the low flow periods in the summertime, will actually go subsurface.
For a little background, could you give us a little background on the size of this watershed and the type of river it once was?
Ooh, well, in terms of size of watershed, I can't say. It's well over 50,000 hectares of land. It's a large watershed, and it was once one of the most productive streams on the west coast. Well, they were all very productive. They had Chinook salmon, steelhead, coho, pinks, chum, and cutthroat trout, dolly varden, a wide range of different fish species, and coho in large abundances.
And this river was also very unique in that it had almost a series of little lakes, just big pools really, but they were so big and deep.
Yes. Well, that's what I would like to get to at this point. The Klanawa River watershed has been, I would say, probably close to 70% clear cut at this point in time. Virtually almost all of the old growth timber or all the valley bottom has been logged, and now logging is taking place on the higher, steeper slopes. And what is happening is that, and this goes right back to the essence of stream protection, and basically clear cutting in itself. You're exposing large portions of the landscape that are covered by trees, and the soil is held together in a network of roots, and all the mosses and the fungi and the forest floor is like a giant hairnet on the side of a hill. I mean, you can grab a piece of forest floor and lift it up and it comes up like a carpet. And this interconnectivity basically holds the soil together. It's a very thin soil, and the soil is actually it's created by leaf fall litter and dead trees and biological activity. And in some places, the soil is only like 30 or 40 centimeters deep. And when you clear cut, you expose this hairnet, is the way I like to describe it, to the drying forces of the sun and the wind. And it loses the moisture that's necessary, that was contained underneath an existing canopy that allowed all these fungi and mosses to live. Well, they die, and when they die, their root network dies. And so what was holding the soil together no longer holds it together, and it just begins to slide downhill. In particular, stream banks, when you log right across stream banks, or you actually drag trees through them, which is what is happening right now, you destroy the stability of the bank, in part by smashing it up with logs as you drag it across. But the main thing is that once the trees along the banks have been cut, their roots die. Streams are generally a U-shaped configuration, and when the trees die, the roots holding the soil die, so then the stream banks start falling in, and then the water just transports all that material downstream. So we're getting millions and millions of metric tons of soil coming down off these clear cuts and through these stream channels into the large rivers like the Klanawa, and it's filled in all the deep pools and the rearing habitat. It's caused the river levels to rise and move sideways, so you get lateral stream bank erosion. All of the trees that were on the side of the bank that provided shade and the wood in the channel that provided stream structure all has been flushed out, so there's no longer any structure for fish. And that's had dramatic increases or effect on salmon stocks.
John, our time's almost up. How can people get involved in this issue as far as protecting the Forest Practices Code and seeing that it gets enforced?
Well, basically, the only thing is eyes in the forest. We need people out in the forest watching. It's a tough thing to say, but I mean, I have to laugh sometimes when I drive past a Ministry of Forests office and I look over and I know that there's 150 employees in there. All of them are making more than $50,000 a year as Ministry of Forest employees. They have trucks, they have skidoos, they have helicopters at their disposal. And I and one of my colleagues, which work for a nonprofit organization, we don't have very many things at our disposal. We go out and we find these things, they're everywhere. We need tougher enforcement. We need the people to get involved, start contacting their politicians and say, let's start applying these laws. Let's start getting people out there. Put more money into protection of the environment.
Thank you very much, John.
You're very welcome.
For Contact and Anderson's, I'm Craig Delahunt. Please join us again next time.